Hi, everyone. I realize that the first page of your slide says Chapter 9, Part 1, but I have included Parts 1 and 2 here. We have a total of 37 slides to cover, so I'm going to jump right into it to talk about the political and economic transformation that led to the development of national states, overseas expansion, and commercial revolution. Here's your timeline that shows the time period we're talking about. We're going to go through Tudor England and Stuart England. We're going to talk about France. We're going to talk about Germany and a lot about Spain, starting from 1394 and going all the way to 1701. So let's talk about the development of the modern state. In the 16th and 17th centuries, kings asserted authority over competing powers. They were the ones who subjected lords and clergy to royal control. But gradually, national territorial state becomes an essential political unit and part of the modern world. So when I say a national state, we're looking at the development of the idea that a state could be autonomous, an autonomous entity that its subjects were owed obligations. And it was kind of the idea of state sovereignty, the idea that the people of a state made rules that impacted the state. Also, during this time, the balance of power principle emerges. These are both very much part of our American life today in terms of state sovereignty and balance of power. Balance of power refers to our checks and balances. You know, we have the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, so that each one has certain powers that check the other one and keep the others in check, so that no one person, no one entity can have a lot more power than someone else. It requires everyone work together. So that balance of power principle emerges during the 16th and 17th centuries. Also, when we talk about state sovereignty, one of the best examples I can give, and someone always brings it up in class, so I am assuming that even though these notes are online, that you've probably thought of this already. So an example of state sovereignty that we have in our world today, in our country today, is that the use of marijuana is not legal at the federal level. However, state sovereignty allows states to make some decisions on its own. So that's why some states are allowing medicinal and or recreational use of marijuana and making it legal in their states. So one of the things that I had an attorney kind of explained one day to me is that the idea of state sovereignty is that the state can't take more from you than the federal government allows. The state can give you more than the federal government allows, but it can't take more than the federal government allows, which I thought was an interesting approach. And we've got some things that are going to be coming up, perhaps at the Supreme Court level, that will be interesting to watch to see how these things kind of turn into play, and if that very concept still remains. Let's move on to talk about Habsburg Spain. Now you're going to see this as Habsburg Spain or Hapburg Spain, but the book refers to it as Habsburg, so that's what we're going with. Ferdinand and Isabella, you know them. They gave Columbus money to explore, right? So Ferdinand and Isabella, their marriage is important because it united the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Let me show you these kingdoms. So here's Aragon, and here's Castile. Very large kingdoms, so when you put them together, much, much larger. And when it's all said and done, they're going to possess much more territory in these areas. So let's go back to talk about Ferdinand and Isabella. The problem is when they got married and they united these kingdoms, they did not develop a legal system or a tax system that would have any kind of common currency between the kingdoms. So you still have two very separate kingdoms operating, but just under one family. They were both Catholic, and it was their goal to drive out heretics, the people who were not Catholic. So if you were a Protestant, you were a heretic to Ferdinand and Isabella. If you were Muslim or Jewish, then you were a heretic to Ferdinand and Isabella. So they used the church in alliance with the state. Church and state are very much together at this point in history for Habsburg Spain. So they start working to drive out the Muslims and the Jewish people. So 1492, we know Columbus sailed the ocean blue because we have that little rhyme that tells us that. But also in 1492, Spain is driving out the last of their Muslims from Grenada. And I can show you that here too. This kind of area down here would be Grenada. And they're persecuting Jews by driving 150,000 Jews out of Spain, also in 1492. The Spanish Inquisition is where people are basically policing conversations to see if people maybe aren't acting Catholic enough, or maybe they're saying something insincere or something that doing something that represents backsliding in terms of the religion. Maybe they're not acting religious enough. So this is a very scary time for people because you definitely have to watch your back and make sure you're on your best behavior. Mind your P's and Q's. Also, old Christians demanded that purity of blood be required for anyone who was entering a profession, a religious order, or universities. So to attend a university, they'd have pure blood, which meant no Jewish blood, no Muslim blood. By 1614, Spain expelled the remaining Muslims. And again, there's that map we've looked at. Excuse me. So Ferdinand and Isabella, eventually, rule of their kingdom is passed down to Charles V, who is King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. I'll show you a map in just a minute to show you exactly what he controls. He inherits their throne. He inherits the Netherlands, Austria, Sardinia, Sicily, Naples, Franche-Comté, and that's in Eastern Europe. And because of this, he becomes the most powerful ruler in Europe. Let me show you his kingdom. This is what we're talking about. Anything on here, the red and white, yellow and white stripes, that belongs to Charles V. Okay, it's a lot. And here's the little area of France, part of Eastern France, Franche-Comté, that I was talking about. So, during Charles V's reign, he starts to see political, economic, and social problems that are eventually going to lead to Spain's decline. First of all, that territory, let's look at it again, just way too much for one person to cover because they didn't have email, right? It's not like they had email or texting that they could message the king or emperor and say, hey, this is going on. What do you want us to do? You know, he could not effectively rule. Plus, remember, there was no economic system set up by his grandparents. So they had this vast territory and they're not really managing it efficiently in terms of the economy. What he did was he relied on the New World, all of this exploration, just like his grandparents did, or his grandparents, to bring in gold and silver. It was easy money. And because that easy money was getting dropped in their lap, Spain never really developed domestic industry or international commerce, which is going to be part of their downfall. And you see this link here. I'm going to include that in Blackboard so you can see it as we continue talking about Habsburg Spain. I've loved this video or this YouTube channel called Food Theory. It's awesome. Anyway, you have to watch it, especially if you're a cereal fan. So that brings us to Philip II. When Charles V abdicated the throne in 1556, his son Philip II takes over. So he's got this vast empire in the old world and in the new world, because they've been sending explorers. But despite that, he's facing bankruptcy. So Philip was a very zealous Catholic, and he sent a huge army to the Netherlands, hoping to crush Protestant opposition. So yes, he talked about it from a religious standpoint. However, do not overlook the importance of gaining territory. Now, I would point out that they've got plenty of territory already. And do they really need more? Well, maybe not, obviously not, because it didn't work out for them. But, sometimes history talks about things in terms of, especially this time period with crusades and that sort of thing, where there's this big religious aspect. And I'm not saying it wasn't important. I'm not trying to take that away from them at all, but it would be irresponsible for us to overlook the financial aspect of gaining a new country as well. So the funny thing is, Philip sends the army to the Netherlands to crush Protestants, but the Protestants win. The Dutch actually won their independence from Spain, and on their own developed successful businesses and successful trade. They were a very successful commercial republic. Not to be totally defeated, Philip decides to send the Spanish Armada to invade England in 1588 to beat the heretic and bastard Protestant queen known as Elizabeth I. However, England beat them. So that was a double whammy for the Spanish. They're defeated by the Dutch, they're defeated by the English. To make matters worse, Philip looked at Queen Elizabeth I as a heretic and a bastard. So let me explain that. First of all, she was Protestant. So to him, she was a heretic because she wasn't Catholic. Anyone who wasn't Catholic was a heretic. So the bastard part, though, is kind of interesting. Henry VIII was her father, and he was married to Anne Boleyn, and they gave birth. They had this baby together as a married couple. But as you know, Henry VIII wanted an heir. He wanted a male son to pass this kingdom down to, and he wanted to divorce Anne Boleyn, but the church, because he was Catholic, remember last chapter I mentioned Henry VIII was a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church when Martin Luther stood up against it. So the Pope says, you can't divorce her. You can't do that. You've got a child, you can't divorce her. So that's when Henry starts the Church of England. I'll start my own church so I can get divorced. Anyway, the marriage is terminated. And at that point, because he and Elizabeth's mother are no longer married, she is referred to as a bastard because she is not legitimately part of the family because the marriage ended. So that's why she's referred to by that term. So just wanted to point that out because you don't see that much in history when people throw that word around. So I wanted to explain it. These two losses were a huge crushing blow for the Spanish, and they start to see it as some sort of divine punishment. Maybe they've done something wrong. So this eventually brings about the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. Philip II went bankrupt in 1596 because of all these wars. And they still tried to play an aggressive role in the 30 Years' War. It was mostly a religious conflict, Catholics versus Protestants. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs joined forces with the Spanish branch in this fight. The French participation on the Protestant side actually tipped the balance against the Habsburgs. There were a total of 8 million casualties. That includes famine and disease. You got to, you know, add that into. And in 30 years, there's a lot of famine and disease that can go on. With the Peace of Westphalia from 1648, Spain recognized the independence of the Netherlands and severed diplomatic ties with the Austrian branch of the family. So the Austrian Habsburgs, they're no longer united. And at this point, by 1660, the imperial age of the Spanish Habsburgs ends because they failed to cultivate industry, they'd never reformed taxes or developed the bourgeoisie class. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the growth of French power. England has a constitutional monarchy. They have a monarch, plus they have elected representatives. Excuse me. France has an absolute monarchy, kings with sole power, and they claim that they were selected by God, that this is the divine right of kings. So they are selected by God to rule. French representative assemblies were called estates, and they were composed of deputies drawn from clergy, nobility, civic leaders, and this had been going on since the Middle Ages. But the early modern French kings started to reduce their significance and basically eliminated interference from them so that the French kings could rule absolutely. Also in France, Henry IV inherits the throne and reconverts from Protestant back to Catholic. So he was Protestant, he went back to Catholicism, but maybe that experience of being both left him a little more tolerant. It seems that way because as king, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598 that granted Protestants some degree, a limited degree, of religious toleration. Now, that religious toleration gets recalled, and let's jump to that. Oh, here, you need to know that Cardinal Richelieu, who was Louis XIII's chief minister, this whole that developed this whole idea of French absolutism, invented a phrase, raison d'etat, which means reason of state. And he increased the power of the noble, or I'm sorry, increased the power of the monarch, but decreased the power of the nobles, which, you know, kind of helps lead to more of this French monarch power. And the nobles had much less influence, starting with Louis XIII and then going into Louis XIV as well. And this is the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. So Louis ruled absolutely according to divine right. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which really, if you're Protestant, you don't want to be in France at this time because your religious freedoms have just been sucked out from under you. So that leaves the French Protestants fleeing from the country. In 1701, Louis tried to acquire control of Spain. England and the Netherlands united against him. Remember, they're still pretty tight over Philip's invasion of them, trying to gain control for Spain. So England and the Netherlands unite against him with the Holy Roman Empire and Austrians. So Louis is defeated because they ganged up against him. The wars emptied the royal treasury, and at the time of Louis's death in 1715, France really needed an overhaul. Remember, they needed to have their tax systems reviewed. They needed a review of church privileges, that sort of thing. And just this failure to reform in France ultimately led to the French Revolution of 1789. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. First, though, I want to talk a little bit about England. The Tudors, who were in power, Henry VII came to the throne after victory in Civil War. His goal was to stop unruly nobles. And during the English Reformation, Henry VIII made himself head of the English Church. So, and we've talked about that already. Elizabeth I was the last Tudor to reign. She was a good ruler. Her reign was characterized by this growing sense of national identity because of the defeat of the Spanish Armada and forming new commercial classes that would ultimately demand a greater say in politics. Also, we have the emergence of Puritanism happening under Elizabeth's reign, which was kind of the English form of Calvinism. And there's a picture of Henry VIII. So in terms of the English Revolution from 1640 to 60, and then again 1688 to 1689, we have Stuart kings, James I and Charles I. Both attempted to rule absolutely, and both wanted to limit the powers of Parliament. But English Civil War erupted in 1640, directed by Parliament with the army under Oliver Cromwell. So let's talk about Charles I just a little bit. Charles I took the throne in, hang on just a second, let's go back here. So we're skipping James, okay? We're going to talk about Charles I. Charles I took the throne in 1625, and he married a French Catholic princess named Henrietta Maria. Now remember, in England, they're constantly going back and forth between Catholic, Protestant, but primarily England tends to be Protestant. So the people do not like at all that Charles married a French Catholic princess. They did not like her because of her religion. The Puritans were very strong in Parliament and spoke out against them. Now, Puritans wanted the Church of England to be very pure. They wanted to remove any kind of toleration or any kind of association with Catholicism. So the Puritans in Parliament are going to be a big obstacle for Charles I. They contested every rule that he made, including taxes. So Charles I says, okay, well, I'm king, so I suspend Parliament. And he did that for 11 years. Parliament did not meet for 11 years. So we have Charles I, a Stuart king of England, trying to be an absolute ruler, which leads to the English Civil War. And the troops under Oliver Cromwell's command. So Oliver Cromwell led this New England Commonwealth. After they overthrew Charles I and pushed him out, which is called the Glorious Revolution, by the way, the Glorious Revolution. They got rid of that horrible Charles I who married that Catholic princess. The Glorious Revolution happened under Cromwell's leadership. So the people said, well, let's let Cromwell serve as our leader in this interregnum. Interregnum literally means between kingdoms. So it's not like the British people didn't want to have a king. They wanted to have a king. They just wanted a better king than Charles I. So Cromwell basically is established as an interim. He's just the guy who's going to fill in until we can figure out what to do. But about 10 years later, He's still there. And or almost 10 years later. Anyway, so he's still there. And as he is getting sick, he realizes that he needs to pass this along, this leadership role along, and he picks his son, Richard. So ironically, he's doing the same thing. You know, he has become a dictator, and he is passing the dictatorship along to his son. The people of England did not sign up for that. That is not what they wanted. That's an alternate to their monarchy. They wanted a constitutional monarchy again. So they went back to the Stuart family and said, who is next in line? And next in line was Charles II. So they restored Charles II to the throne in 1660, which ended the interregnum. Here's the picture of Oliver Cromwell. And here's a picture of Charles II. So when Charles II came back to power and the kingdom was actually put back in Stuart control, this is what we refer to as the Restoration, because the kingdom was restored. The people of England were excited when Charles II took the throne, not only in England, but we have colonists at this time. You know, English colonists in America were excited when Charles II took the throne. And we spend a lot of time talking about this period in US history because it's so important, because it helped boost the trade between Great Britain and the colonies, and Great Britain and the rest of the world for that matter. Okay, moving on to Germany. The Germans really failed to achieve unity. The Holy Roman Empire was administered by nobles who extended and consolidated their power over peasants, towns, and cities. Basically, the Treaty of Augsburg from 1555 gave each ruling prince the right to determine the religion of his subjects. So this whole idea of religious disunity prevented political unity. And that's why Germany never really completely unified. So from 1450 to 1750, we're seeing a lot of overseas exploration and economic expansion. We have colonization and exploitation of the New World. So let's not forget that. Also exploitation of people based on the slave trade. So why did people want to expand? Why do we have people willing to go to an unknown world? I think I've mentioned it before in this class. Basically, the idea of inheritance always went to the oldest son. So the younger sons of these people would not get an inheritance. So the idea of exploring or going to a new world to establish yourself gave you an opportunity to develop a fortune that you did not have at home. So it gave opportunity to some of these people, like the landed aristocrats, and people who had no money, had nothing to lose. So maybe they could make something of themselves in the new world. Merchants wanted to break monopolies, and so they moved and colonized, looking for new sources for goods to sell, like pepper and spices and silks and all of that. The Portuguese first expanded into the Atlantic islands in the early 15th century, but by mid-century were establishing trade posts along the West African coast. They developed an imperial economy based on sugar and slaves, also gold in West Africa, the Atlantic islands, and Western Europe. Also, we have two Portuguese who have sailed around the southern tip of Africa and discovered an all-water route to the Orient. That would be Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama. Back to Spain a little bit. Spain stumbled onto its overseas empire, which was the largest and richest until the 18th century. Columbus discovered the continents of the New World while looking for a western route to India. Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean at the Isthmus of Panama in 1513. Magellan circumnavigated the globe. He went around the globe. And that was important because nobody fell off, right? The world wasn't flat after all. Also important just because it had not been done. This is a very important time where exploration was key. Also, in terms of Spanish explorers, Cortez defeated the Aztecs and conquered Mexico. And these conquests really brought in a lot of silver and gold to Spain. Also, the black slavery, slave trade that was going on during the period of dominance over North America, the Middle East and Muslim states had engaged in slave trade across the Sahara. So we have the trans-Saharan trade in the 18th century, where as many as 10,000 slaves were transported each year. But by far, the transatlantic slave trade between West Africa and the European colonies of the New World that started early in the 16th century was by far the biggest. By the end of the 1700s, nearly 80,000 slaves per year were being captured and traded. Most African slaves were prisoners of war or kidnapped victims sold by African chiefs or African slavers. And here is a sugar refinery in Brazil using slave labor. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. Approximately 11 or 12 million Africans were exported to the New World over the centuries. And the Middle Passage was rough. It was the voyage across the Atlantic from Africa. It was brutal. Transported slaves were crammed into small ships, and the living situations were bad. I mean, just packed in. And so conditions were dirty, not very sanitary, lots of disease broke out, and generally speaking, as many as 30% died during this Middle Passage. The slave traders got rich and invested profits in banking and insurance, plantations. The ironic thing is that many of these people, these slave traders, were devout Christians who didn't believe that this human trafficking was a violation of their faith. In the 18th century, Quakers and Methodists became outspoken critics of the British and American slave trade. In terms of the price revolution, we see inflation developing because of population growth. Cereal prices multiplied 8 times or more during the century. The population of Europe almost doubled between 1460 and 1620. So you had too many people with too much money competing for too few goods. That creates inflation. Which, if you have been listening to any news, you may have heard as the coronavirus started impacting manufacturing and development, that the country had seen inflation developing because we had too few goods and too many people needing to spend money. So inflation still happens today. The price revolution had the greatest effect on farming, which caused ambitious farmers to jump in and take advantage of the situation. This is a painting that shows crops being harvested by peasants in the Netherlands. Excuse me. Let's skip on. We are getting near the end here, and I want to finish before I lose my voice. So one thing you need to know is the putting out system. So until the development of the putting out system, basically you had artisans or skilled labor who did certain jobs. Now we have this putting out system, which makes things cheaper. So let's use the example of shoes. Let's say if I am a skilled shoe craftsman, then I can charge you a lot of money to make you a pair of shoes. But if, say, in our village, we have someone who is a leather tanner, then and they could do that fairly cheap, then somebody else would maybe cut the leather, somebody else would sew the leather, someone else would make the soles for the shoes, someone else would stitch all of the stuff together to the soles. And each person had a job. It's not an assembly line, but it's like a process, a manufacturing process. And that's what the putting out system was. Here, the notes use the example of wool. So you might collect wool from a landlord, take it to a village to get for spinning, and take it to someone else to dye it and someone else to weave it, and then finally it was shipped to market. So the putting out system develops during this time, which makes goods a little bit cheaper. Okay, I'm going to skip over the expansion of trade and industry. And actually, we'll just mention here that the changes that we see developing during this time eventually lead to what we now know as capitalism, with a system of private enterprise where individuals make their own economic decisions. So that's it. Nope, not it. One more slide. We can actually finish there. So that does it for chapter 9. A lot of information here. I know we jumped through a lot of hoops. So if you have any questions, drop me an email and let me know.